the second talk in a very small series of 2 talks on language discrimination in a multicultural world. This is sponsored by the Charlene Sato Center for Pidgin, Creole, and Dialect Studies, funded through an initiative, the Diversity and Equity Initiative on campus. And hopefully, we will make this an annual event, depending on, money. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Rosina Lippi. I think her book was probably the first one that I read as a graduate student in the late 90s that brought together politics, critical theory, and sociolinguistics in a way that was very compelling and inspiring. So I think I'll never be the same after having read especially her chapters on language in the media and doing things like incisive analysis of Disney films and the use of various dialects to convey stereotypes. That made a big impact on me. And that book is now in its 2nd edition, and it's just an indication of the importance of the messages that she has to share. That book discusses everything from media influence to the judicial system to education, exposing the ways discrimination based on accent serves to perpetuate power asymmetries. Dr. Lippi received her PhD in linguistics from Princeton University and served as a faculty member at the University of Michigan for 10 years. She then moved on to be a full-time writer, and something I only knew or came to know recently is that she's a fiction writer of historical fiction and has at least 3 names. So I try to follow you. She's Dr. Rosina Lippi in our context, in this domain of academia. She's Sarah Donati in the world of historical fiction. And she's Rosina Lippi in her family life and elsewhere.
And other fiction.
And other fiction. So please welcome Dr. Rosina Lippi.
Well, thank you for that nice welcome. What shall I say? Most of it's true. So, let me talk to you today about, it might seem a little bit, it's not a tossed salad. Hold on, and you'll see that there's a theme here. So I'm just going to, these concepts are probably familiar to all of you, but maybe not to all of you, so I'm going through them quickly. So the variability of language, all of these changes, variation in language is not random. Sure, not random, not almost always emblematic. We know that we have seen over 50 years of study that variation in language conveys information about the speaker, which in turn helps to establish social relationships. And the primary tool in establishing social alliances in the performance of identity. Performance theory is something that's more recently brought into the anthropological end of sociocultural linguistics, but it works beautifully as a format or a platform for analyzing what's going on. Indexing and reestablishing social power structures and asymmetries. So, performing identity, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of depth, but you can kind of, it's pretty intuitive, targeting specific points of variation that are relative to project a specific self-image above or below the level of consciousness, which we all do every day in all of our interactions. Framing is a term that's used for more deliberate projection of a particular set of social characteristics. And we do this to align with specific language communities or distance ourselves from them. So a targeted speech community is, of course, speech community is identified by constellations of social characteristics and identified by bundles of language variants And these are just some of the millions and millions of them for the American English-speaking world. We have, and each of these could be further divided. There are, speech communities that distinguish themselves primarily on the basis of religion, such as Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg and Brooklyn. African American could be divided into, I don't know how many different. There's studies of categorical differences in rap on the West Coast and the East Coast, for example. Fishermen in Martha's Vineyard, Portuguese at Fox Point in Rhode Island. It's just wherever you go, if you look hard enough, you will see how people group themselves. Oh, sorry. Now, the standard English is there like sticking out like a sore thumb, and the asterisk is there because, and I borrowed that from syntax because it doesn't really exist. It's that concept in the mind that's associated with a certain set of social characteristics, the empowered, people with who consider themselves to be superior. So I'm sorry about that little icon. I don't know why it's doing that, but
that's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing.
I want you to pay attention here. There's just a couple of little clips of Obama speaking in different settings to different people, to different audiences, and to pay attention to the way he uses variables, phonetic and syntactic and morphological variables, but also non-linguistic variables to connect to his audience in ways which sometimes you could be called dog whistle. Are you familiar with that term, dog whistle rhetoric? That is going to go over the head of a lot of people, but the target that he's looking at will understand what he means. And that can be done positively and negatively. So this first one is the dog whistle. Oh, sorry, again.
That's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her back in the 1990s. So I understand it, and when you're running for the presidency, then you've got to expect it. And you just got to kind of let it.
So you know what that's about, right? That uproar? No? That you don't know what that's about?
I think you should explain.
Huh?
Please explain.
I can't remember the name of the song right now, but there's a rap song about brushing it off, and the video of the rap song, that gesture is made. He's talking here about being badmouthed by other Democratic candidates during the campaign, and he's very kind of high-minded response, saying, well, this is the way it's been done, and we've got to brush it off. So now, what's really funny about that is that if you had a different angle on this, and I couldn't get that video clip. There's a couple of African American men in their 30s maybe who just spring to their feet when he does that. They're just so enthusiastic that he's done that. And then the white people are kind of like up to, so they didn't get it, but they see that somehow other people got it, and then it's a good thing. So
that's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her back in the 1990s. So I understand it, and when you're running for the presidency, then you've got to expect it. And you just got to kind of let it. Hey, he's a white guy. He's Hawaiian. He's Hawaiian. It's not going to
I was looking for clips of him interacting with small groups of Hawaiian. It was not easy. It was the best one I found. At least you can see how very much at ease he is. Nothing else. Did you catch anything of what he said clearly? No. I wished I could have.
How you doing, sir? Michael Torber, retired Sergeant Major, sir.
Man, retired Sergeant Major. He still look like a Sergeant Major. He's still up, man.
I just want to say, sir, I wanted to, on my tour, I wanted to always shake the hand of the next president and the man that's voted against the war. I did what I had to do, sir, and I'm putting my faith in you.
That means a lot. Did you just retire recently?
I'm a Ranger, sir.
We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very, very much. A Ranger? That means this guy can kill you with his bare hands.
I'll let them mess with you, sir.
I like that.
So I'm hoping you got the various linguistic and also para-linguistic features there. And now it's going to go back.
That's the lesson that she learned when the Republic.
It's just not.
That's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing.
No. It's not showing me the thing on the screen, and I'm not sure how. Ah, there we go. No?
That's the lesson that she learned when
I'm sorry. No? Swap display club.
That's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her back in the 1990s.
Can you tell it to
So I understand it, and when you're running for the presidency,
Yeah, and you? I was seeing the two screens, but on the left side where I was supposed to be seeing what you saw, I wasn't. Yeah, I was not seeing here, so I couldn't, that's why I was having trouble reading some more. All right. That's all right. I'm not going to be able to stop it. I'll just keep it going.
that's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her.
So, you're going to see a couple more clips of him talking to different kinds of audiences. And so the barbershop that was in South Carolina during the campaign, and that was an all-black audience in a barbershop, which is a very, very specific kind of speech community. And his body language was very specific, and also his morphology changed. In Hawaii, we can't really hear what he's saying, but I get the sense that he's at least trying to remember what it means to sound. Anybody know if he can handle any pidgin at all? Can't? No. There's no way to know these things, obviously. I have these kind of fantasies about sitting down in the corner of the family room when they're having their Thanksgiving dinner, you know, and listening to them talk so you can really hear what they do in a normal situation. But I haven't had any luck with that. I'm going to skip ahead to this next one. Okay. This will be taking too long. Okay, so you've got this linguistic push-pull thing where they do walk over to double consciousness in the 1900s. Geneva Smitherman, I think, was the first one to use the linguistic push-pull terminology, and this idea that you have to submit to subordination or you have to stand with solidarity. You have to make a choice between those two. And so if you don't want to make that choice, then the powers that be will enforce upon you the importance of doing that, and then use measures that discredit or demean you or the group that you belong to by focusing criticism on arbitrary forms of grammar usage. So acts asked. Everybody knows about this one. Pressure to mark language for allegiance to the community. You hear people say things like, you know, you talk funny. If you look at somebody and you expect them to sound one way, you will often hear commentary about that. And here, for example,
Yes, half black, half white. And because of that, we find ourselves particularly adept at lying. Because on a daily basis, we have to adjust our blackness. Yes. You know what I mean?
There's many reasons we do that. I mean,
Yeah.
to terrify white people.
Yes, that's one of the main reasons.
Because I mean, you know, with the way that we sound, the way that we actually talk,
Yeah.
we're not intimidating anybody.
Oh, no.
We sound very white.
We sound whiter than the black dude in the college acapella group.
Oh, yes. We sound whiter than Mitt Romney in a snowstorm. But that's the reason. When we're around other brothers and sisters, you will see us. You gotta just, you
gotta dial it up a little bit.
Well, see, you know what I'm talking about, brother.
Oh, you know I know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. No doubt, man. No doubt.
Because you never want to be the whitest sounding black guy in a room.
You put 5 white other black guys in the same room, you come back in an hour, it's gonna be like Lady Smith Black Mambazo over there.
I wanted an A, you know? I wanted to be smart. I wanted to be the person who had the right answer. And I didn't care whether it was cool, because I remember there were kids around my neighborhood who would say, "Oh, you talk funny. You talk like a white girl." I heard that growing up my whole life. I was like, I don't even know what that means, but you know what? I'm still getting my A.
was she talking like a white girl there? No. She was definitely not talking like a white girl there. She was bringing in all the intonation and body language. So you can see that there was probably a lifelong push-pull here. And she clearly moved towards the subordination end of things because that's what she wanted to be and that's what she wanted to do in order to achieve her goals. But it's not without cost. And the only other time, and I don't have this on video, but Samuel Lee told me about, she was speaking to a group of college students who were primarily black, and she said to them, "I'm going to do like my husband do now." And then he said that's the only time he has any documentation of her using any kind of African-American terminology. But you know, if you got to sit around that table at Thanksgiving afterwards, and they're telling stories, and they're, you know, you're going to hear more. And what that says to me is that this is a person who has to hide part of herself in the public eye. All right. So now if we look at the election, when you're looking at candidates, you're asking, who are you? Right? Who are you to me? What can you do for me and mine? What can you do for the country? And up until 2008, there were some things that we knew without even looking, right? That we would be looking at white males, upper middle class, and positions of authority. That was the expectation. There was no other expectation. Over the last maybe 30 years, every once in a while, there was a little blip. You know, Geraldine Ferraro, nobody took that seriously at the time. But generally, anybody who's going to make it to the actual ticket was going to fulfill these characteristics. So 2008 comes along, and we all had to rethink what it meant to have a candidate in front of us and who that person might be. And the distinctions here were race, obviously, sex, and class. For all three of them, although class really only shows up, and you'll see in talking about Palin and the media reaction to Palin. I think of all the stuff we look at, the Palin is most interesting because it's the most unusual. And nobody's really looked at it, as far as I can tell, very closely from a sociocultural variation. So if you're going to talk about the candidate, you know, if the media did what they're supposed to do, theoretically, they'd be talking about the political record, successes, failures, and character in terms of, you know, is this person able to confront Congress or, you know, that kind of thing. But even when they're trying to do that, other things sneak in. So you have Jeff Davis, Republican, this was in 2008, using the word boy, which I still, to this day, wouldn't you love to have grabbed him by the lapel and said, what the hell were you thinking? You know, even if it was in your head, well, you're a politician, you know better than to say what you're thinking. So even the U.S. Supreme Court decided in 2006 in Ash versus Tyson Foods that using the word boy was in fact evidence of discriminatory intent. So I guess he could have sued him, but I don't know. Then we have Jonathan Capehart, who's an African-American journalist, writes for the Washington Post, and he was appearing on Daily Joe, which is a morning talk show in 2008. And this is fairly early after the nomination went through. And he uses some pretty loaded terminology, uppity, for referring to black people in this, it's almost as bad as boy. And it's particularly shocking because of his own background. But almost nobody noticed it or said anything about it. Now, this is an clip. Note under reports what it says. This kind of thing goes on constantly on Fox News. And it goes on so constantly, it's kind of hard to believe that it's always accidental. So then, okay, so we talked about the candidates, and their Fox News is always trying to draw a connection between Al-Qaeda and the president. They also talk about the way the candidate talks. Now, this is not new. This is about President Roosevelt in 1937, that a female critic, I guess she called herself, a journalist, confronted President Roosevelt, who refused to concede that he had used background. It's kind of amazing to think. I mean, it's not amazing to think that people were using language in this way back then, but it's amazing to think that it was picked up by the media in this way. In her letter, she asked, "Did you learn to talk like that way at Groton or Harvard or where?" This is a serious insult. And the media reported on it, and of course Roosevelt did not comment. But it's the earliest written example I've been able to find of what's the implication here? That he is not the person he projects himself to be. He projects himself to be an educated man, but in fact he's low class. So this has been going on even more recently. This is an ad from the way it appeared on the television screen. I remember this, I'm sure a lot of you do. Support the United Negro College Fund, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. And was this in the 70s? I can't remember. Dan Quayle, who was infamous for mixing things up, said, "What a waste it is to lose one's mind. Not to have a mind, it's being very wasteful, how true that is." In '89, it was pretty late. And this was reported in every major newspaper and every channel. So why was this reported? What do you think? Why would this be reported? It's funny, right? But generally, you don't see the media making fun of middle class or upper class white men, even if they have a strong accent. You don't hear it. A couple of politicians do get picked on because they have faux pas. I'm not really sure what to call it or something. What would you call it? Word preservation. Yeah. You know, Reagan did it. Reagan did it a number of times, and of course Bush II did it many times. So it's reported on as something funny, but there is something mean-spirited here as well. So it's just interesting to compare how the media reports things like this to the way that they handle issues of race, class, and gender. Okay, so we've got the word articulate, and Aleem and Geneva have a book out this year, Articulate While Black. It's very worth reading. They look at everything very closely and take it all apart in more detail and with more insight than I could possibly, because she is who she is. So when Obama was being nominated, you got statements like this from his own people, using the word articulate. He's bright and clean and articulate. He's nice looking. He's a storybook. Okay, so obviously what's going on here, it's insulting on about a million different levels. And then you get somebody, David Wexler from the Examiner, saying his well-practiced articulate diction is more a focus of attention than the primetime lineup. So he's questioning maybe the focus on this issue of articulation, but at the same time he's using the term himself. He pushed that magical button, a black man who was articulate, liberal, the whole white guilt, all of that. White men commenting on Obama felt that they couldn't address the issue of his color directly. So what do? They address his language. Then it went overboard. Is Obama obnoxiously articulate? And can he live up to the standards? And this was a leaked internal RNC campaign memo, what they should be playing up in their discussions. So McCain is different from Obama in these ways: action-oriented versus grand prose, accessible versus humble servant of the country versus arrogant. So this was actually a plan that was put in place. You get people, and every African American person I know who I've known in an academic setting has told me a story like this, where they've been told, you speak with such confidence or surprise. When I'm teaching this, I always say to somebody at the beginning of the class, "Oh, you buttoned your shirt correctly." It's that kind of, it's on that level that kind of insult. Okay, and D.H. Hughley, who's quite forcefully spoken and very opinionated, and generally I agree with him, is talking here about articulate, and some African Americans see this as more of a problem than the N-word. So I don't know how many people would agree with him on that, but certainly some. Now we have this.
In part, on the purpose to heal the racial divide. We were told that this was a watershed moment for race relations in the United States. But recently, the president and his party have, in different ways, demonstrated that they're not above using race to advance their left-wing agenda. Last night, President Obama spoke to the NAACP and channeled his best Jeremiah Wright accent.
If John Lewis could bring billy clubs across the bridge, then I know young people today can do their part to lift up our community. If Emmett Till's Uncle Mose Wright could summon the courage to testify against the man who killed his nephew, I know we can be better fathers and better brothers and better mothers and sisters in our own families.
Now, why does the first African-American president feel the need to affect an accent that he clearly does not possess? Or is that the way people speak in Honolulu? It's a cheap attempt to pander to an audience that already supports him.
All right, so the accusation's there that he's a fake, he's appropriating something that doesn't belong to him, that he's trying to tie him to Reverend Wright, who they've already tried and found guilty. They question his origins. He's exotic and privileged. They question the fact that there might be African Americans in Hawaii who speak African American English, and they accuse him of pandering. So it's pretty much the full. Now, that's about race. Now let's look at gender a little bit. Hillary is a very well-to-do, upper middle class kid who went to the best schools, has a stellar career behind her, speaks articulately, and you know, and with great passion about many things. It doesn't seem very much for the media to focus on in terms of her language, but they found some stuff. Okay. Her voice is grating. Okay. She starts to get screechy. She needs a radio shock collar. How do we beat the bitch? So it's not really clothed here, right? Nobody's going to say, well, she doesn't speak English well. They can't say that. So they have to move to related with different things. Hillary uses a fake Southern accent to pander to blacks. I have a clip of that. And she tends to shift to a Southern accent in the South and when she's talking to blacks. Now, of course, right, we've gone over this, every politician in the world, every individual in the world accommodates to the audience that they're trying to impress or convince. So this is nothing unusual.
Well, over the weekend, Senator Clinton and her campaign took a trip down south, and apparently so did her accent. Listen to this.
I don't feel no ways tired. I come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road would be easy. I don't believe he brought me this far to leave me.
Okay, so here's the thing. I think you can accuse her of bad acting. But you can't accuse her of being insincere, right? Now, Obama shifts very easily from one variety of English to another. He's been doing this his whole life. Hillary is trying to do it in the time-honored way of all politicians, reaching out to the audience, but she has no ear for it, and no practice at it. When you hear her R's, she had the most horrifically strong Midwestern R. You know, if we're going to try to sound Southern, that's the first thing you get rid of. But she seemed to almost be, you know, hitting them harder. So the media took this and said, oh, look at her, how funny she's trying to sound black, how condescending. You know, she's trying to convince her audience that she's one of them. Can't win for losing. Now here's the one I think is probably least studied and most interesting. With Sarah Palin, socioeconomic status came out of the closet in terms of open class warfare in the presidential campaign. Everyone bought into her frame for herself immediately, so she's one of the folks. She framed herself as working class, rural, with a distrust of education, vilifying the intellectualism, native wit, Christian focus, okay? She wanted that frame for herself. She built that frame. She did not shy away from it. She built on it.
We have a great promise to be a self-sufficient state made up of the hardest working, most grateful Americans in our nation.
I say it ain't so, Joe. There you go again, pointing backwards again, though. You prefaced your whole comment with the Bush administration. Now, doggone it, let's look ahead and tell Americans what we have to plan to do for them in the future. You mentioned education, and
so she's performing as well. The first clip you saw was her talking to a camera as governor, you know, a serious subject. Here she shifts immediately to an unprecedented informality, and not only unprecedented, but immediately her authenticity was challenged here. Right? And if you look on YouTube, you'll find clips called Sarah Palin and Gunderson syndrome. Do you know this from Fargo, the movie Fargo? That she was trying to sound like the characters in Fargo. You betcha, you know. Whatever she was trying to do, it didn't. And no matter who reacted to her about it, and the press did not. And I think the press did not because this is clearly a class issue. It worked for her. So the way the media looked at this was, they made decisions about her intelligence, right? She's stupid. She makes the party look stupid. She's easily manipulated, and I could have gone on and on and on with these comments here. And then they comment also about her English, and they get, you know, poetic about it. They notice all the things she does wrong. They link these two things together. Okay. So Palin's frame for herself was compromised by her lack of preparedness. So you could say, if Palin, anybody ever hear Will Rogers, recordings of Will Rogers talking? He had a very strong, very rural accent. He's very, very smart, very clever, very quick with the repartee. If Sarah Palin had had that kind of smarts, they couldn't have talked about her intelligence like that. They might still have talked about her language, but they couldn't, because they couldn't link the two together, it would not nearly have been as strong. So, she compromised her own frame by her lack of preparedness, which allowed the media to reframe her and her constituency as willfully uninformed, uneducated, and stupid. Okay, this is the problem. So the media becomes complicit. They link rural, working-class language markers to incapable, uninformed, unworthy. Sarah Palin is unacceptable because, and you would get things in here like she's a hick, she's a rube, she's stupid. So that the two things, her intelligence and her way of speaking and the frame she built for herself, become so intertwined that you can't separate them. Now this is what's wrong with the liberal media, right? Because buying into this only makes conservative people feel abused, and rightfully so. Okay? I can show you a zillion, I don't have them here, but I could show you many, many clips of people like Keith Olbermann, you know, very prominent liberal commentators making fun of Sarah Palin, okay, and other people like her. Where does that come from? You know, you have to ask yourself. So it gets worse though. Political cartoonists and comedians and commentators, it's a ritual that's always been there, and that's okay. The parody of political candidates is a time-honored thing. But then you got, when it came to Sarah Palin, you got Saturday Night Live, you know, they have this president's thing every time there's a, and sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse. And this is a reunion of all the presidents brought together. So this is a crossover point where reportedly hard news television program turns satire into news and erodes whatever claim Palin might have had to a serious bid for the vice presidency. Look at this. Okay. They're talking about Palin and they're showing a picture of Tina Fey. Now you laugh at that, right? But that's the same thing again. It's the point, exactly the point I'm trying to make. That you can go on the internet and see all, you know, stupid conservatives, and they'll show you sign after sign that's misspelled, which people take as permission then to discard any real concerns that these people might have. So this is where we get there's a major gulf between right and left that does have to do with class and is to a great extent perpetuated by liberal Africans who take joy in belittling people who happen to maybe have less education and don't agree with them, and the two things probably aren't linked at all, but there you go. So, and that's what I am. 25 minutes. Yay. Questions?
So we have some time for comments or questions.
I'm actually really glad you mentioned the Fargo thing, because I don't know why, but I was thinking about Sarah Palin the other day and trying to figure out why someone from Alaska would sound like they were from Minnesota.
Good girl.
or something. It's interesting. Do you know anything about how she
Yeah, there's
came to
actually,
that?
somebody gave, there's a really great article by Salmons, Joe Salmons is one of the authors, and they did a really close analysis of her language both in and outside of televised, and the movement over space and the development of the Matsu dialect, which is where she grew up. So I can't summarize that for you, but I would direct you to it because it's really, really interesting. And their conclusion, a little bit of their conclusion was that she, really the thing that's most marked about her public performances is the degree of informality, and that's what stood out. And the along with that comes, doggone it, and all these kind of silly exclamations. So somebody in the room sat down and said, "How are we going to project? How's she going to project herself?" And she was, I'm sure, part of that discussion. Right? And she said, "This is who I am and who I want to be and who I want to identify with." Now, how they came to the conclusion that this was the way for her to do it, there's no way to know that. How they feel about it today would also be really interesting. Was that a good decision? Do you think she would have been taken more seriously if you had heard her talking the way she did in that first clip as governor? You wouldn't have dismissed her out of hand, probably. Now, again, it's probably not right to dismiss her out of hand just because she's projecting herself in this kind of odd, silly, exaggerated way. But we're so conditioned to do that. Our ideology is so strong that we can't get away from it. There's a whole school of humor in the South that depends on men, usually men, with strong Southern accents and idiom, who are taken as, who are assumed to be stupid, and turn out to be far smarter than the murderers. Right? That's a whole trope. Maybe they were hoping that that's what would happen with Sarah Palin, that people would make fun of her and then realize, wow, she really does know something and she has good things to say. Unfortunately, they didn't prep her well enough for I wouldn't say unfortunately, I didn't vote for her, I wouldn't want her, but the point is that she, I don't know what they thought they were doing, if they thought that it didn't matter that she didn't know that Africa was one country. If they just didn't know the depths of her unpreparedness. If they thought that her appeal to the working class would override all of that, which it did for some part of the population. People who did not care the fact that she couldn't name a newspaper and couldn't name a Supreme Court decision. None of that stuff is important to them. If you look at those clips, you have people saying, "This is the first candidate I've ever come across who's like me." Now, I've never understood that. I mean, they said that with Bush in World War II. Oh, I didn't want to have a beer with Bush. And I used to say, yeah, if I need brain surgery, I don't care about having a beer with him. I want gore. I want the surgeon, and this is somebody who needs to do a job. But it is important in the minds of some of the electorate. So they were, I guess, counting on that more than they should have. But to what degree they counted on the liberal media riling up the working class by doing the very expected thing of making fun of them, that's a good question. Yeah?
I was actually in Alaska working in Alaska Native communities at the time of the campaign.
Oh, yeah?
So I was there when they announced her being the vice president candidate. And then I was back again later in the campaign. And when it first got announced, everybody was very excited. Everyone in Alaska, the Native population I was working with, was very excited. They were very proud of her. And they echoed some of these statements like, she sounds like us, she's got working class values. She kind of represents us. Previously she'd done some things in her position as governor with big oil that a lot of the Alaska population was very proud of. But in the end, what I think turned the population in Alaska away from favoring her was not so much her this realization that she was kind of stupid, right? That she just wasn't informed or she wasn't professional. It's actually some unethical behavior that she did. So there was something, I don't remember exactly what it was, something with some emails from her staff that she leaked on purpose or something like that. And it was the unethical behavior that turned a lot of people away rather than something like that, yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories about her, like, let's say, bad behavior, behaving badly. But most of the country didn't hear about that, right? They were pretty good at corralling it. It was mostly in Alaska.
I was there.
Yeah. So what would you say turned the country as, on the whole? Anybody who might have been interested in what she had to say, who would share a basic set of principles with her, who would have been favorably disposed towards her, but then, you know, had to draw back. And there's lots of big names that you can put into that basket, right? And the only thing I can think there is that they, you know, her lack of informedness and her complete lack of embarrassment about being uninformed. That was part of the problem. With insisting that, you know, she could see Russia from her house, and that did mean something. And so that those are all personality, and but really the important things here are that she chose a frame for herself that was very language focused. She drew on all kinds of language markers and characteristics to project that. And as a result, she gave the liberal media especially tools to go after her. Now, whether or not they would have done that if she had been, you know, better informed and with stronger, well-formed opinions, it's hard to know. But it would have been a more interesting election, certainly, to see what went on there. Would people have then attacked the media and said, you can't make fun of the way she says the word nuclear? You know, there's a whole thing about the nuclear, and I can't even say the difference anymore. I don't think such a thing. Yeah?
I'm from Belgium, and we have a multicultural, multilingual country. And so when people get elected over there, they have to speak at least 2 languages, which is Flemish and English and French. And so I was wondering, since I've been over here too, that in the elections in America, isn't it possible that candidates can speak with different varieties of English without being portrayed one way or the other because of it? Because I know in Belgium, for instance, when they get elected, generally speaking, they have to speak both languages, and the prime minister is either from the French side or the Flemish side, and they get often very problematic, derided, because they don't know the other language as well as they know their native language. And so I was wondering, in America, is there a comparison that we can do to that?
Up to the 2008 election, the media went very easy on candidates who had, say, a marked geographical, you know, Lyndon Johnson. If anybody mentioned his Texas accent, I haven't been able to find it. Jimmy Carter. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, yeah, they didn't like Carter, that's right. But did they talk about his, you know, did they talk about his variety of English? And I don't know. If you can find it, I'd be interested to see it. But up to 2008, language was pretty much off the table. They did not make a big deal about regional or other variations. Yeah?
Yeah, question. So I'm inferring that language did not become an issue with Reverend Jesse Jackson. And about President Barack Obama's articulate when did it start in the media? When he became, let's say, a viable, possible candidate?
I think that was already happening when he was running for Senate, but it was in a much more restricted geographical area. It wasn't until he was on the big stage that it really went crazy. And the country just, it just amazes me when people say post-racial. I think to myself, what university is it? So I think it was there, but it wasn't until he stepped up for the presidential nomination that it really became a big deal. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, throwing this out there, sort of a thought, is it somewhat fair to say that Palin and her handlers brought some of the treatment she received on herself? There is, Richard Hofstadter has written about anti-intellectualism in American politics. journalist Charles Pierce wrote a book called Aid America about how anti-intellectualism has become a selling point.
Right, it has, yeah. And she was one of those main salespeople.
And so therefore she is expressing solidarity for anti-intellectualism and saying, I'm one of you, and therefore she is inviting what raised
absolutely. And,
intelligent, educated segment of our society.
You know what's really interesting to me, though, is that even after the election, the Fox, which is the most extreme right-wing media, could not leave this thing alone about the intellectualism. They had whole talking points about it. Obama ordered a sandwich someplace and asked for Dijon mustard. And they went into this huge riff about how he was too elitist for American mustard. I'm not and you can find it all over YouTube. You know, not just once, somebody saying this and decided, oh, I guess American mustard. It turned into an actual talking point. So that, you know, their desperation, the anti-intellectualism they thought, I guess, was going to get them farther than it did, and they just couldn't let it go. They still can't let it go. But nothing as bad as the Dijon mustard. Yeah?
I wonder whether, to some extent, the payday going down thing was picked up much more because it's gendered. I mean, because part of the thing you were talking about, you know, all these names you're saying in the past, you know, they were male.
Of course. It's hard to know, isn't it? Because there's no
real comparison.
Yeah, there's nobody to compare.
And I just wonder, because I have to confess, I don't watch Fox News or Sarah Palin, but I wonder whether you've done anything on, you know, her attempt to reinvent herself as a commentator for Fox.
I didn't go, Pat. That would have been interesting, but I did not go there. My plate was full, but I might still do that. That would be kind of pushing me that too. But you know why you know the story about why they kicked her out? She announced that she was not going to run for president on a small radio program of a friend, and they wanted, you know, they considered that they paid her for that, and she gave it to somebody else, and so she was a persona non grata and was basically kicked out of it. So that, you know, that actually shows that, you know, her commitment to what she considers to be working class, middle American values is actually, you know, not without foundation. She really feels that way, which, you know, you got to give her credit for. I guess. So yeah, it would be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if we, you know, have more women, hopefully, in the next elections. What will happen with that? But I don't think we'll ever get a repeat of the Sarah Palin thing because they just. Yeah.
I'm actually thinking ahead. I'm wondering, because all of the people you talked about so far have had various regional American English accents. Have you been thinking at all about what happens when we have a candidate who actually has another language as their home language or something, and they may actually have an accent?
Well, you mean like Rubio and
yeah,
like that?
but for the most part, it seems to me that the people that have been on the national stage, if they are ethnic, they sound very standard.
Yeah.
And so far, I haven't noticed that beyond like a California state level.
Kennedy was extremely Boston, right? And what's his name from New Jersey?
Chris Christie?
Chris Christie is as New Jersey as you get. And I lived in New Jersey for 6 years, so I recognize him as a type, and I recognize his language, and you know, he does not pretend to be somebody that he isn't linguistically. And then you have people like Marco Rubio and other people who came up bilingual Spanish, English. I think Marco Rubio is Cuban, and Bill Richardson's the Mexican, right? It'll be interesting to see when they go onto a national stage, because they haven't so far. They're at the stage now where Obama was, you know, when he was in the Senate, Illinois Senate, was a senator for Illinois. When they move up, we'll see if people are going to make a big deal about that or not. I would not be surprised if they did. There will be, you know, I have 100 different slides of incredibly racist stuff on the internet. You know, don't renege that with the White House and just horrific stuff. And you know, of course, that's going to come up again with people who are
So you don't think we live? So we're talking because we keep talking about post-gender, post-racial.
No,
we don't live a post-lingual society then.
No.
We're basically ever yet.
No, post-lingual is not going to happen because it's the back door. It's what you can talk about somebody sounding stupid and not be slapped on the wrist for it. Right? You can say that person, you know, she doesn't even speak English properly. They said those things about Palin. Of course she speaks English properly. She's a native speaker of English. Her grammar is impeccable. It's what she did with her grammar, which is but they disliked her intensely, and because she had features in her language that linked her to a group that they felt that they could, with impunity, slap around, they did it. You know, God forbid that Obama had ever said axe for ass. That would have been, I just wish he had done it once.
He got a lot of attention for the fist bump.
Oh, yeah. There's a big thing in the Geneva Smitherman and Samuel Lean book about that, looking at the whole history and how it was misinterpreted and mistaken and on purpose.
But there's a very famous situation also about Obama when a supporter of McCain's campaign came out. It was also in 2008. She came out. She said, "Oh, I don't want to vote because he's an Arab." And McCain took the microphone back from her and he said, "No, ma'am, no, man. He's just a guy I disagree with."
Yeah.
But he didn't go a step further, saying, even if he is an Arab, it's still okay for you to be
course.
voting for him. I mean, he didn't go that step further, and I think Ben Affleck mentioned that when he was on Ben Marsh's show. And I thought it was a really good point. I mean, there's nothing wrong.
It was a good point, but the thing is that there was some, it went so far that he could not say something, right? If he hadn't said anything at all, he would have been crucified for that, and, you know, rightfully so, if he hadn't corrected her. But he went only as far as he absolutely had to go. And, yeah.
Is there any good research to indicate how much these linguistic markers overrun or compete with other markers? For example, you know, Sarah Palin was fairly well-to-do. John McCain is very wealthy, and yet they were portraying Barack Obama as the elitist.
Yeah.
And you know, this makes no sense in reality, yet somehow they're using linguistic markers.
Well, you know, it's about, this is where, you know, Chomsky and the media stuff comes in, because they tell you what they want you to hear, and they manipulate the image that we have of people. And so it's certainly possible that somebody might have spoken up and said, wait a minute, hold it, how are you defining elite, and what are we talking about here? Nobody ever did that. If they did it, the media didn't report it. So it's, the media has a huge amount over what, of course it's less now, thank goodness, with the internet. You know, we have a little more access to a variety of opinions. But as far as I know, that was never picked up or promoted or discussed on any kind of a larger stage. But it, you know, it should have been.
I'd like to suggest that join us for a reception. If it's not raining, it's outside that way, just beyond this building. And if it's raining, it's in Moore 575. I don't know if it's raining. So we have little tables in the courtyard back there. It's a nice little space if you've never